August summer night, soldiers passing by, listening to the wind of change.
Hello and welcome to The Road from Communism, Lessons from the Former Yugoslavia. This is one of a series of programs that we're doing on the end of the Cold War. The events that we're talking about in this series either typify the end of the Cold War or in some instances even help to precipitate the end of the Cold War. What we'll be talking about today, though, will revolve around the area formerly known as Yugoslavia. We will be showing some very graphic photos during this, and so we want to warn people in advance. This series is brought to you by the American Democracy Project, the History Department, as well as the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics. I want to introduce our guests quickly. To my left is Eldin Hasic, who is a student here at IPFW, and on the other side of the table we have Livschiz, assistant professor from history, and James Toole, associate professor from political science. Thank you and welcome. And let's not waste any time. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's help people find this in the world if we can. So we have a couple of maps that people will be seeing shortly. Jamie, why don't you help orient people here?
Okay, well, I think the first map that we are going to see is a map of the whole continent of Europe. And when we look at this map, we find what we formerly knew as Yugoslavia down in the lower right-hand corner in southeastern Europe in the Balkans. And here we have a close-up map now of Yugoslavia itself. And the first thing to note about this map is that the country of Yugoslavia was divided into 6 republics. And on this map, conveniently, the republics, well, almost conveniently, the republics are color-coded, but there is one exception. Let me take you from northwest to southeast. In the northwest, colored in blue, we have Slovenia. Then in yellow, we have the Republic of Croatia. In the middle, we have Bosnia and Herzegovina. In the pink, we have the Republic of Serbia, except that in the lower left-hand corner of the pink-colored area is what was a separate republic known as Montenegro. The rest of that pink area was Serbia. And in the bottom, at the bottom, in the red, we have Macedonia. What is also interesting and significant about Serbia is that within Serbia there were 2 regions that were formerly divided off as provinces. They were part of the Republic of Serbia, but they were provinces within that republic. One is Vojvodina in the north, which has somewhat less significance for our talk, but the other is Kosovo in the south, and of course that has, sadly, a lot of significance, and we will come to that a bit later on.
So, Anne, why don't you help us by putting this in a bit of historical context, talk a little bit more about the time period we'll be talking about here.
Well, the focus, our discussion is going to be primarily focused on the events of the 1990s in the region that Jamie just described, but we are going to have to start with a little bit of a historical discussion. And here we have to be very, very careful to make sure that we draw keep a fine line in our discussion of the historical background to the conflict, because one of the things that we'll see, and I think this will come up again and again over the course of the discussion, is the way that oftentimes the conflict is framed as sort of these ancient hatreds that have been festering for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so it's very important that from the very beginning we make it very clear that the problems in Yugoslavia before, after its creation after World War I, after its recreation after World War II, the breakdown of Yugoslavia, the creation of the new nation states, and the accompanying ethnic cleansing, all of this is rooted in the 20th century history of nationalism, and not in this kind of very ancient conflict. And here, it's important to note also that we're trying to frame our discussion of what happened in this region in the 1990s within the context of the end of the Cold War. That so often in the narrative and so many of the other events in our series focus on the positive developments that have taken place, kind of this triumphalist approach, that the end of communism translated into triumph of democracy and a better world. And the case of the collapse of the Yugoslavia and what happened there with the end of the Cold War really demonstrates that it doesn't have to always end in a positive note. That there could be other paths after communism, and that's why the title of the talk, Jamie's idea, the road from communism, really indicates that road does not have to necessarily end in democracy. And so talking about the 20th century history of Yugoslavia, we start very briefly after World War I. Yugoslavia is created, and almost immediately problems, the interwar period really has a lot of problems for this newly created country, in large part because of different assumptions that the different ethnic groups and the regions had for the newly created state. The Serbs assumed that Yugoslavia was a reward for them for their sort of continuing on the struggle of the South Slavs. Croats and Slovenes had somewhat different ideas. And ultimately, the interwar Serbian domination, or the perception of that domination by Croats and Slovenes, really indicated that if there was going to be Yugoslavia after World War II, certainly the issue of equity was going to have to be addressed. And so we have during World War II, a very brutal conflict, and really the failure of this interwar experiment becomes very evident in the explosion of the nationalist resentment and brutality during World War II, exacerbated, of course, by by the addition of the Nazis into the mix and the general context of World War II. And then we have, as a result of the anti-Nazi resistance, we have a leader emerge, Tito, leading the anti-Nazi communist resistance, and he becomes the leader of post-World War II Yugoslavia. And his solution to that perception of inequality between ethnic groups was to grant each nation its own territorial unit and government apparatus. And this is that goes with the images, the map that Jamie discussed earlier. And the idea was that these units would be national in form and socialist in content. But at the same time, there was also an effort to promote sort of supranational institutions, a supranational Yugoslav culture, the army as, again, something that didn't just belong to each region. And then, of course, fear, right? Fear, the secret police, all of those things kept the country intact. And there are different interpretations. There's a freezer model that there was nationalism bumbling under the surface. Tito kept it in check, versus the incubator model, the way that Tito approached the different ethnic groups and he played them off against each other, actually kind of contributed to the strengthening of the resentment. But ultimately, when Tito died, this is where you start to see the effort to redefine the relationship. And without one clear leader, a new system emerges. You have the rotating government going from one nation to the other, and that's where we get to the 1980s. And Tito dies in 1981, and then this experiment in post-Tito governance, combined with the economic problems of the 1980s, combined with the broader context, leading to the trouble in the Eastern Bloc, this is where we see problems really start to emerge. You have the economic difficulties affected different regions differently. You have resentment building up. The better off areas like Slovenia are resentful of having to float up the other areas. Serbs feel that that they're being dismissed, and that their interests are not being, are not really being taken into account. And then the permission of the rise of politicians like Milosevic, who really used nationalism as an important rallying force, and the permission of national parties based on, other than communist national parties. All of this really creates a very volatile situation by the time we get to the late 1980s.
But really, in that time period, we're not talking about a time of complete peace, are we? And we're talking about some what you might refer to as wars, aren't we, Jamie?
In the 1990s, you mean?
Yes, sorry.
Well, yeah, certainly. We're talking, I think, about 4 wars during this period, but we'll probably talk much more about 2 wars than about the others. The first war comes, and maybe we could put the map of Yugoslavia back on the screen if we get the chance. But the first of these wars, there we go, is the Slovene War. In Slovenia, in the blue, in the upper left-hand corner, that was a very short war that I think we don't really need to go into, significant for people involved, but not of great larger significance. Then there's a war, and that was in the summer of 1991. Then we have a much more serious war in Croatia, mainly in 1991 and 1992. And again, Croatia here is in the yellow, although this is a map of ethnicities, so it's not going to be quite as clear, but Croatia being the next republic down from the upper left. The 2 wars that I'm sure we will talk mainly about are the Bosnian War, fought in and around Bosnia-Herzegovina between 1992 and 1995, and Bosnia is right in the center there. And as we look at that map, we see a graphic explanation, very brief but graphic explanation of why that area was so heavily contested. We see an intermixing of ethnicities, and this map is showing us the settlement patterns of different ethnicities within former Yugoslavia. And right there in the heart of the country with that patchwork of color is Bosnia, a 3-year awful 3-year war, essentially pitting Serbs against Croats and against Bosnian Muslims. The other war that we'll talk about that is significant is the war in Kosovo. And the war in Kosovo, of course, is fought in that southern province of Serbia and pits ethnic Serbs against Kosovo Albanians.
And the map that's up on the screen right now, for people who are wondering, that's actually Bosnia-Herzegovina in terms of a much more detailed breakdown of the ethnic composition of folks who are living there.
Right, and this is significant because only about 1/3 of the districts in Bosnia, and I believe there are 100 districts in Bosnia, only 1/3 of them before the war had an ethnic majority. In other words, a majority of one ethnic group. All the others had no single clear majority. So there's a tremendous amount of intersettlement among the ethnic groups, and this is, of course, a very difficult problem.
Let's talk a little bit more about what caused the situation to sort of finally boil over in the late 80s and 1990s. We've seen a map that shows that in some respects you might think that it is related to the ethnicity of the groups there, the lack of homogeneity in some areas, but that's not really just it. There are other factors at play here. Anne's already mentioned a little bit about the nationalism. What else sort of caused this to boil over at that point? I mean, we do have some slides that will come up that will show some images of the time period that people may find a little disturbing, but for example, the first one shows a soldier actually kicking someone who's lying down on the ground. So Anne, what else caused the situation to boil over?
I think that there are a couple of things there. I mean, I think there's plenty of blame. There's plenty of blame to go around, and I think that there are a couple of things. I mean, the process that I described earlier, I mean, ultimately, the creation of these different parties, free elections in places like Slovenia and Croatia, what it leads to is the election of politicians who want independence. And so there's a wave of these declarations of independence, places like Slovenia and Croatia, and this is where Serbia becomes increasingly concerned because of the political leader that Serbia had. I mean, he starts off as a communist and rebrands himself very successfully in the late 1980s as a nationalist, sort of perhaps absorbing the worst features of the two ideologies and embodying them. And for him, I mean, Slovenia, and part of why the Slovenian war was not quite as dramatic is that, you let that one go. Croatia, you fight for a while and you let that one go. But Bosnia, that was because of the multi-ethnic nature of Bosnia, that was something that Milosevic was not willing to let go. And in a sense, he used the precedent of independence. It's sort of this idea that, okay, Yugoslavia is an indivisible entity. Once you start seeing Slovenia and Croatia go away, the concept of Yugoslavia as an indivisible entity, is also now falling by the wayside. And if you can divide up Yugoslavia, why not divide up Bosnia? And so this is where you see, I mean, this is why there's conflict, of course, in Bosnia itself, but Serbia plays a very important role in fomenting the conflict in Bosnia to ensure a certain kind of outcome that they are interested in, namely making sure that Bosnia does not become independent, and that there are certain territorial units within Bosnia that become part of Serbia, or whatever they want to call it at that moment in time, Greater Serbia, Yugoslavia, truncated Yugoslavia, however they want to deal with it.
And so at this point in time, we have folks who are attempting to, in many respects, almost dehumanize folks. One of the slides that was just up a second ago was a photograph on which the faces had literally been scratched out. You're the one who found that photo.
Well, this is where, I mean, essentially the Bosnia conflict that Jamie referred to earlier, I mean, this is where we really see brutality unfold because in an effort to make sure that Bosnia could become part of Serbia, you had to undo that ethnic diversity that was such an important feature of Bosnia. And so as a result, this wave of, the wave of violence sweeps through Bosnia. And when we say wave of violence, it makes it seem like it just kind of happens, and obviously it doesn't just happen. It is carefully orchestrated and carefully organized, but the goal is to cleanse certain territories of people who are not Serbs, so that you could have evidence to show that this is a region that actually belongs to Serbia. And what that means is killing people, of course. The ones you don't kill, you hope that they will just leave, and you make create the conditions to force them to leave. And then once they're gone, you have to erase the record of them ever existing. And that photograph to me is so poignant because pretend like nobody else was ever here. Pretend that this was never a multi-ethnic state. Pretend that this was never anything else other than Serbia, populated by Serbs.
Sure. Eldin, you were actually born in the area, and if we can ask the folks in the booth to bring up one of the earlier maps so that we can help you help us find exactly where you were born, that would be very good. But so tell us a little bit about your youngest years there. What was your childhood life like during this period?
I was born in '88, so I was 4 years old when the war started, and I started first grade right after the war ended. So I spent from 4 to 7 is the years of the war. I'm from a town called Velika Kladuša, and it's the northwestern corner of Bosnia. I don't know if you could bring up the ethnic map. It's the green circle, that green patch in the northwestern corner of Bosnia. What gets, I don't want to, it's very complicated as it is, but what gets even more convoluted in my hometown is that basically the municipal government, for varying reasons that really aren't really clear even now, breaks away from the central Bosnian Muslim government and basically fights a civil war against other Muslims. They have a smaller war within a war, and the way they end up impacting my family is that, for reasons of more or less geography, my mother's and my father's side of the family end up being basically on opposite sides. As far as spending my childhood within that context, it's simple as this. One of my earliest childhood memories is going to a funeral when my uncle on my mom's side of the family died in '92 at the very beginning. The war, in terms of intensity, was worse in the part where I was from in '93 and '94, a little bit later on. And when the front lines came close to where my family was from, we had to move to Croatia, and we basically lived in a house that was abandoned by Serbs who fled Croatia, and then we fled our home and lived in an abandoned house in Croatia for a year, and then we came back, and then again the dynamics of the war changed, and we fled again, and then eventually we came back, and that was more or less the end of the war. What happened is my father was separated because he was mobilized in the military and so forth, and he didn't make it back to Bosnia until almost 6 months after the war.
And geographically, that green spot on the map that we're talking about, how large is that? Help people figure out the literal size of that.
In terms of population, it sort of covers 4 or 5 municipalities or districts, and I would estimate maybe 100,000 people, 200,000 at the most. Basically, that border of Bosnia reflects the borders of the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the region where I'm from is called Krajina, which doesn't really have a good translation in English, but it amounts to something akin to borderland or frontier. And the ethnic dynamics sort of reflect that on the Bosnian side of the border, the population is Muslim because that was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And then across the river in Croatia, the population is Croatian and Catholic because that was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
But certainly areas close enough that you would have reason to interact with one another in sort of the 1980s, 1990s modern sense of travel is not that difficult. You're nearby one another, right?
Right. Well, people always bring up the example, that my town is 7 kilometers from the border, and now you need a passport, for something you could cross, just walk across basically earlier on.
Sure. Well, Jamie, you've studied this region quite a bit, and I'll refer to it as the collapse or the breakup, whatever you want to call it. Does this follow a particular pattern that you have noticed elsewhere? Is this unique to its own situation? How would you describe this?
Well, yes and no. It follows a pattern. It follows a pattern in some respects. In other respects, it's unique. There were other multinational states following the end of communist rule in Europe that fell apart. The most obvious of which is, of course, the Soviet Union, which broke up relatively peacefully into its constituent republics, all of which became independent. But of course, that's, I say, relatively peacefully. There are, debilitating conflicts around the edges and in various parts of the former Soviet Union, but in no way was conflict engulfing the whole former Soviet Union. The other important example is, of course, Czechoslovakia, which broke apart peacefully on the first day of 1993. The Czechs gaining their own country, the Czech Republic, and the Slovaks gaining an independent Slovakia. So, it's interesting because we have these different modes of trying to figure out how to reconcile ethnic differences. In Czechoslovakia, it's fully peaceful. In the former Soviet Union, it's generally peaceful, but with some areas of extreme violence. And of course, what makes Yugoslavia unique in this region is that it was engulfed in horrific violence for the better part of a decade.
And people have used the term ethnic cleansing when referring to this region. So since I know you two are students, you want to make sure that people use the right terminologies. Ethnic cleansing, the right terminology? Should it be genocide instead? What is the term that should be used, and why is that the term that should be used?
Well, this is a big debate. To what degree is it just ethnic cleansing, or to what degree is it also genocide? And let me just say that it certainly was ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is the forcible removal of an ethnic population from an area in order to make that area ethnically pure. And of course, it's a terrible euphemism, but it's the only one we have, and we must use it. But it's terrible because forcibly removing a population, of course, involves all sorts of horrors. That's ethnic cleansing. Genocide is the attempt, or the attempt to exterminate in whole or in part an entire ethnic, racial, national, or religious group. So the big difference between ethnic cleansing and genocide is that in genocide, you have the intent to actually exterminate this group from the face of the earth, at least one segment of it or the whole group itself. But then the ethnic cleansing, your goal is not necessarily to kill everyone off, it's just to remove them from the area. However, that usually involves a tremendous amount of violence, including often lots of mass killings, systematic rape, all sorts of awful things. So both are really terrible, but there is an important distinction. And one of the continuing arguments about former Yugoslavia is whether the violence there did in fact rise to the level of genocide.
And we've been seeing a number of images up on the screen. Some of them should bring up other incidents. I mean, the first few images we saw were actually from concentration camps. And why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the images that we've been seeing and how we might want to frame them in a historical context?
Well, I think one of the problems that we have, I mean, just that very expression, and just to go back to one of the points that that Jamie made, this expression, just ethnic cleansing, right? I mean, there's something kind of fairly horrific because, of course, ethnic cleansing was a euphemism. It was a euphemism that was supposed to sound kind of the sanitized version of to cover up the atrocities that were actually part of the process. But I think, part of the problem that we have is because we do have genocide, right? Thanks to Raphael Lemkin, the concept itself. One of the problems that, as a result of that, and the fact that genocide has been proclaimed illegal by the international community, one of the problems is the distinctions that are drawn in order to avoid necessitating the kind of a proper kind of response. And one of the problems is that, of course, a lot of these images that we see there, they look very familiar. They look very, very familiar and disturbingly familiar because they evoke images of the Holocaust that are such an important part of popular culture and education system in the United States and in at least in Western Europe. And one of the things that happens, of course, is how do you relate what happened in the former Yugoslavia to this precedent? Do you treat the Holocaust as a warning, or do you treat it as a kind of precedent that has set the bar so high that as a result, unless it's 6 million people in ovens, you can't, nothing else can compare, and therefore it's really not quite as bad. And I think that those images in the heart of Europe really underscore kind of the horror of what happened. I mean, and I totally agree with you. I think the terminology is very, very important because we don't want to throw the word genocide around because that defeats the purpose. But just because it's ethnic cleansing does not really take away from kind of the horror of what unfolded in this particular region. And the fact that there is the Holocaust is such an important frame of reference. I mean, one of the things that happens is that in a sense the Holocaust is undescribable. On the other hand, what happened in former Yugoslavia is, because now there is this frame of reference. Survivors can talk about feeling like Jews in Europe. We can talk about the pictures of the camp, the pictures of the people behind barbed wire. We can talk about this is just like Auschwitz. And in a sense, it almost makes it, well, now we can describe it. It takes something so horrific and it makes it more describable, and therefore not quite as horrific.
And some of the images we saw, we're cycling through them again. We can see the concentration, or the ones that evoke images of World War II concentrations. These certainly were concentration camps as well. But a number of them are just photos of what would be daily life. Buildings that were bombed out, the sign for children crossing the street completely blown apart. So Eldin, these are things that you would have seen on a daily basis. How did this affect your daily life there?
Well, I mean, you bring up the concept of homes. One of the things that happened in our house is that while we were gone, while we were living as refugees in Croatia, a sniper shot our house with an incendiary bullet and set the house on fire. So when we came back, basically my mom and my aunt and a few other people basically had to clean our house to get the char and the smoke off the. And it took like 3 months to do that, and it was just. As far as just living daily life within that context, I would just say that things that were sort of normal for me, if I think back about it now and just sort of actually think about what things were like, they were just seemed completely crazy. For example, as kids we would collect empty shell casings of AK-47 bullets and use them as toys, and that was just something we did. Another thing that happened is that we have like power outages here, and everybody freaks out, and we didn't have power for years. And when I was 5, I think in '93, I had this daily ritual where I'd turn the TV on for 10 days straight after we lost electricity, and it never turn on. Another thing also is just that just being within that context, you see people who have missing limbs on a daily basis. Just the act of going to a hospital as a child. I mean, you're in a waiting line, and the people in front of you are soldiers who lost their limbs, or some people who have eye patches because they lost an eye or something like that. And it's just, even today, as I went back, you still run into people who wheelchairs because they may have stepped on a landmine or something like that. I mean, just the reminder is constantly there.
So how did the rest of the world start to become aware of this?
Well, this was in the age of modern electronic mass media, and these images just started flashing around the world on 24-hour television news networks. And so of course what this meant was that there was great concern in many countries right away. However, that concern didn't translate into much action, and we can talk maybe a bit more about that. But on a popular level, people with access to television, which is most of the people of the world, very quickly saw what was going on, at least in terms of the images. Now, it was a lot harder to understand why it was going on and who was killing whom and that sort of thing. But almost immediately there was a great uproar at the carnage that was taking place.
So we find ourselves in a situation where we have a reference, World War II. We've seen similar sort of incidents happening before, so we should, in some respects, be able to really understand this. But what was the global reaction when this did start to make it out, and what did people think?
Well, I think that this is one of the situations where there was an overabundance of information about what happened, and partially refusal to believe, right? I mean, the images are so horrific that you just can't quite imagine that this is happening in Europe, right? I mean, perhaps if it was happening somewhere, in the uncivilized world, maybe it would have been okay. But the fact that this is happening in the heart of Europe really seemed completely unacceptable. And then the other problem, and this is where the history of it kicks in, right? I mean, it became so easy. I mean, not knowing too much about the region, having it be one of those crazy parts of Europe where people's names are spelled funny and nobody can really, pronounce no matter how they're spelled, made it relatively easy to dismiss the region as, well, those crazy Balkans, right? They always do this sort of thing, and precisely because there were so many complexities, and I think Eldin's story in his particular region illustrates, the nature of the complexity, of the struggle, made it easy to dismiss it as, well, you can't stop these sorts of things. These sorts of things just always naturally happen. And one of the disturbing things is, there is the Holocaust frame of reference, of course, but some of the features of the ethnic cleansing are peculiar to what happened, and information about them was made available relatively quickly, because in addition to these camps that look so familiar, there were also other things that I think are harder to take pictures of, but were such an important part of the process. The mass rape, using rape as a strategy. You have all the usual problems with rape, the problem of underreporting, but rape, but this was a kind of a very strategic, this is an important part of the strategy to drive people out, to ensure that you don't, that the people can't, propagate themselves, that they're so humiliated that they're forced to leave these particular, these particular areas. And this is the kind of violence that, a lot of NGOs talked about and brought attention in human rights organizations, but ultimately not one that has very, evocative pictures that you can point to, and therefore, is becomes in a sense again easier to dismiss as a result.
So, although there are groups dismissing it, was this a shared reaction throughout the world? Was everybody dismissing this, or were there some countries more likely than others to say, no, this is something we need to respond to, or groups of people?
Well, the United States and the Europeans took it upon themselves to try to solve the problem. However, what we see, and here I'm really talking about the war in Bosnia from 1992 to 1995. And what we see are the Americans and the Europeans saying, okay, we need to solve this because this is a violent conflict within, the continent of Europe of great strategic importance, certainly to Europeans, but also to Americans. However, we see a sort of a series over the 3 years of broken promises, of complete misunderstanding of what's going on in Yugoslavia by the Americans and by the European Union and powerful European states. We see manipulation of the Americans and the Europeans because of their relative ignorance by local leaders on the ground in Yugoslavia, taking advantage of the lack of knowledge and et cetera, among the Americans and Europeans. So it's a very confusing situation, and people become more and more upset because they don't see anything actually solving the problem of the Bosnian War. And you also see disagreement between the Americans and the Europeans. You have, for example, the Americans saying, look, this is in your backyard, we'd be happy to help, but you take the lead. Sure. And Europeans, for their part, had just several years before celebrated the coming down of the Berlin Wall. There was a lot of talk within Europe about how this was a new and more powerful Europe that should be able to solve its own problems and march forward into history. And so at the beginning, at least, many Europeans thought this should be our job. But the Europeans had trouble handling it, then the Americans had trouble handling it, and it took 3 years for outside force to actually help to end the war.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to, the one thing I would add is that there are not country-specific differences in the approach, but I think that rather than talking about the American approach, I would talk about specific individuals, because I think within the United States there were a few individuals who really took it upon themselves to draw the attention of the United States to the problem and to try to affect public policy and foreign policy towards that region. And I think, what's dramatic about the conflict is, of course, it spans a couple of different administrations, not just different presidents, but different political parties. Right? You have the Bush Senior administration followed by the Clinton administration. So you have two different American administrations with different approaches, ultimately being and efforts by different groups and different individuals in the United States to try to either get the United States involved, or NATO involved, or the EU involved, versus not get involved. And there's a wide range of reasons why some thought that this is worth our attention, and others thought that it wasn't. But of course, the complexity of the situation definitely made it easier to not get involved ultimately.
Well, as Anne mentioned earlier, some of these wars you could kind of let go, but we reached a point where we couldn't let go. What made when NATO forces finally decided to get involved, what made the situation unique that we couldn't just let it go?
I think a sense of public exasperation with the idea that this war had gone on and hadn't been solved. What essentially NATO had done from the beginning of the war onward was increasingly start to threaten usually the Serbs, who generally, of course, the main aggressors in this war, although in the end atrocities were committed on all sides. I think it's not too controversial to say that the Serbs were mainly to blame. And so NATO was increasingly calling on the Serbs to stop and increasingly threatening airstrikes, but not following through. In essence, NATO was bluffing and saying, you know, we will hit Serb forces with airstrikes if you don't stop what you're doing. And the Serbs didn't stop what they did, and NATO didn't go ahead with the airstrikes. Well, finally, after several years of exasperation, NATO got serious and went ahead with actual airstrikes, prolonged airstrikes on Serb positions, and in fairly short order, the fighting stopped. And this is, of course, a very brief and all too cursory overview. But essentially, when looking at Western action and NATO action, that's what happened.
We do have up on the screen right now a map of Yugoslavia that shows where Serbian forces were. For those who look at the map very carefully, they'll notice that it gives the location of artillery and personnel, etc. But Anne, you had a comment that you wanted to make.
I just wanted to add that I think that, in addition, again, not disagreeing with anything that Jamie said, but just adding that you have the growing exasperation, and then the massacre, the Srebrenica massacre, that really sort of precipitated, in which the Serbs kind of, I guess this was their miscalculation, that they took the bluffing, and they assumed that they basically took over the territory that was controlled by the UN, and proceeded to kind of carry out a very rapid, a horrible massacre in one town. And that was seen as going too far, that the UN authority was so definitively threatened that NATO that was the last straw that forced NATO to step in. And then once NATO started bombing, actually, in the first NATO bombing, the conflict ended very, very quickly. Although, one of the really amazing things about that particular that conflict is that while the bombing was taking place, you actually have. The Serbs still continue to carry out atrocities, but ultimately, relatively quickly, Milosevic gives in and puts an end to the fighting.
But why the bluffing?
On whose part?
On NATO's part. Why continue to bluff? Why not actually strike?
Because NATO countries didn't want to take on any more risk than they wanted to take on. It was a tremendously violent civil war, and Western leaders, I think, felt we would like to solve this at virtually no cost to ourselves, which is very self-interested, but certainly isn't the first time in the history of world politics that countries have acted in their own self-interest. I mean, the West was afraid to suffer too many casualties and wasn't willing to suffer too many on behalf of other people. And this is a recurrent theme in our struggles with dealing with gross human rights violations around the world.
Well, and precisely because it was seen as a purely humanitarian mission, the reluctance to get involved in a purely humanitarian mission. But the other issue is sort of the issue of sovereignty, that, do we want to set a precedent for intervening in the behavior of a sovereign nation? And I think ultimately seeing it, being able to reframe it not as a sovereign matter, a national matter, but rather as an act of aggression by one country against another really helped frame it and rationalize it that something really does need to be done.
And so NATO eventually did say, well, we're willing to do this. So it was the first time that NATO forces ever struck a sovereign nation, as Anne has pointed out. And when they did, we have a series of maps that you'll see in just a second here that show that when the strikes began happening, the Serbian troops, the strikes in Kosovo, I should say, the Serbian troops actually continued to move. In fact, if you see the maps, you see the first one there, they're, I don't want to say limited to just the northern or northeastern part of it, but as the strikes took place over about 11 days, I think it was, the next map will show you that the troops moved further to the southwest, and then the next map shows you even further to the southwest. So while they're being struck by NATO forces, they were actually trying to advance their own cause.
And I think we should, that's a very good point. I think we should back up for a moment, though, and say now we're jumping 4 years ahead to the Kosovo War in 1999. However, the dynamic linking NATO's actions in Bosnia and NATO's actions in Kosovo is exactly as you described it. What happened, in short, was that NATO bluffed in Bosnia, hoping it could get away, hoping that if it just bluffed, the Serbs would be afraid enough by the mere threat to stop fighting. They weren't, and it took actual airstrikes in Bosnia to end the war. When the conflict loomed in Kosovo province 4 years later, NATO set an ultimatum and said that if Serb forces don't stop their ethnic cleansing and their other atrocities in Kosovo, NATO was going to start airstrikes. And rationally, the Serbs decided that NATO was probably bluffing again and they could get away with more fighting. It turned out this time, NATO had learned its lesson, not to bluff, and that when you say you're going to do airstrikes, you need to do airstrikes. And this time they did for a period of 2.5 months, eventually stopping the Serbian atrocity in Kosovo. But as you rightly pointed out, the Serbs took full advantage of the airstrikes to continue the ethnic cleansing while the strikes were going on.
Well, I think that this is one of the really interesting differences between the NATO response in Bosnia and the NATO response in Kosovo. The Bosnia one was relatively short, kind of very strategic. It was called Operation Deliberate Force, and it was seen as more or less, because Milosevic folded relatively quickly. And then you have the Dayton Accords. The Dayton Accords, as a result of which the territory of Bosnia is divided up. And I just want to give some statistics because they're going to be important to the way to explaining the seemingly rational behavior of the increase in ethnic cleansing while the NATO bombings are going on. As a result of the Dayton Accords, the Serbs, who constituted 31% of the population, got 49% of the land. The Croats, 17% of the population, got 25% of the land, and the Muslims, the Bosnian Muslims, who were 44% of the population, got 25% of the land. Those were the Accords because, in a sense, there was this first. And so when we get to the bombing in Kosovo, I mean, again, you have the reluctance because, technically Kosovo is part of is attached to Serbia. This is not an attack, an act of aggression, but ultimately, the lessons of Bosnia prevail. But that was a much longer period of time. And here, I mean, you can look at it and say, wow, Milosevic is behaving fairly rationally. He's willing to sacrifice the kind of the damage to, the loss of lives, the damage to Serbian infrastructure, while Serbia itself is being bombed, and devote the resources that he has that could have been perhaps used for something else towards continuing ethnic cleansing. But it's really remarkable, first of all, the relationship between these wars and ethnic cleansing, how important. I mean, that was the goal. That was the integral the centerpiece of all these activities, because the result would be that once the bombing would stop and some kind of an arrangement was going to have to be made, the more ethnic cleansing you carry out, the better negotiating position Milosevic would actually have, because the territories cleansed from from non-Serbs, you could make an easier argument that those territories now should be Serbian. And so that's the sort of the kind of under the cover of NATO bombing, the continuation of the atrocities against civilian population.
Could I just underscore one thing that Anne said that I think is so important, that the goal of these wars, from the point of view of the perpetrators, was ethnic cleansing. The point was to remove other ethnic groups from their own territories, in the minds of these sick extremists. So if you want, there's no better, simpler explanation of the wars in former Yugoslavia than that. The whole point was ethnic cleansing from their point of view, and we see it in the very sort of rational but sort of sick thinking of leaders like Slobodan Milosevic.
So Eldin, you obviously were very young at the time period, but you said yourself you tried turning the TV on for 10 days straight hoping to see something. Was there news coverage of this? I mean, do you remember reading papers? Have you gone back to read newspapers now to see what was being said, and what was the coverage like? Well,
the radio was functioning, so the radio station, most of our news came from there. And you could also get some Western, for example, there's a German broadcast in Bosnian that radios could pick up, and so those are sort of, you get a perspective that wasn't biased. It wasn't one of the ethnic groups broadcasting their own version of things. But so that's the way my family found out about the way when the Dayton Peace Accords were finally signed, was over the radio. And it becomes this big moment that this conflict, this seemingly was going on forever, that had no end in sight, was finally it's officially over. And then most people remember exactly what they were doing when they first heard about the Dayton Peace Accords being signed and so forth. But I just want to backtrack a little bit and just we're talking about the delay and the things like that. I sort of being in my position, you get the perspective of that from the other side, and it's being very young, I don't remember it much, but my parents, I've talked about this. It's just this horrible feeling about just depending, being helpless and just depending on waiting, just having this hope that someone out there must care, that this is the return of fascism to Europe, that someone out there must care, and you're waiting basically for this cavalry to come in and end it. But it's, of course, days went by, months went by, nothing happened. I talked to my mom last night because I was doing this, and she just mentioned that just listening to the radio and just just listening to the names of the people who died that, you know, she may have gone to high school with or something like that, and just forgetting that and then just going to the next day and just listening for the new names, because, you know, you hear the names from yesterday and you forget about those because there's, you know, other names are being, other people have died the next day, and you just sort of move on, you know, from day to day like that. But as far as, you know, the war ending, I think the reaction within Bosnia is, again, it depends, you know, who you talk to and, you know, what their, you know, what side they were on and things like that. But I think that, so, you know, it's very mixed. But I think, you know, the U.S. and President Clinton remain fairly popular. I mean, most people blame the West for, you know, waiting too long, but there's still this gratitude that, you know, something was done eventually. At great cost. And people, you know, for example, I remember, you know, seeing, you know, drums of cooking oil with the words, you know, USAID on them. So people remember these, you know, images that, of, you know, that there was, you know, some aid and some help from the outside.
And one of the slides we saw earlier, it was the side of a building with graffiti painted on the side of it, and it basically was a thank you message to the troops for finally doing what, now in hindsight, obviously the folks living there were hoping would happen sooner, and today's scholars, I think, would maybe argue should have happened sooner as well. What was the sort of reaction around the rest of the world in both instances when the NATO strikes actually took place in Bosnia versus the action that was taken in Kosovo? Was there an agreement that mistakes were made in Bosnia and we had to do something differently in Kosovo, or what changed? Why did we not bluff the second time, so to speak?
Well, I think we learned, and I think policymakers learned. And remember, too, that this, as Ann pointed out, this was, well, there were two U.S. administrations involved, but the Clinton administration was in power for most of the Bosnian War and was still in power here in the Kosovo War. So the administration learned, I think, not to bluff. And again, we don't want to oversimplify, but I think that's the main lesson. I don't know. I don't know what else I would say about that.
I mean, the thing I would add is that, I mean, I think the perception really depended on where you were, because I think one narrative would be that if we care about slaughter of innocent, I guess I'm divulging my perspective, if we care about the slaughter of innocent civilians, primarily unarmed, in Europe or anywhere else in the world, then we have to develop a strategy for dealing with that. And if we're going to threaten force, and the threat of force doesn't work, that we actually have to follow through on the force. And so in that sense, you can see the continuity between Bosnia and Kosovo. Although, of course, in parentheses, we would want to add that certainly, you know, there were certain, you know, Clinton, there are a number of other things happened in Africa and so on that affected the way that Clinton needed to view international conflict and domestic problems that needed him to behave a certain way internationally. But on the other side, I mean, the international response, I think, especially less so to the Bosnia bombing, because it was much shorter and in a sense more clear cut because of the international aggression aspect of it. The Serbia, you know, the bombing of Serbia had a very mixed response in different parts of the world. I mean, Russia, as you can imagine, was really up in arms about the bombing of Serbia. I mean, for this one, I have a kind of an interesting perspective because I was in graduate school at the time, and one of my colleagues, you know, another graduate student who studied the former Yugoslavia, he was actually in Belgrade at the time, and he was outraged at the U.S. bombing. Well, I mean, in part because, of course, he was there, but also in part because he saw this as completely unacceptable. And there was a lot of discussion about, you know, how do you make sure that it's carried out properly, right? That you don't violate the Geneva Convention about bombing civilian targets. There were some unfortunate incidents like that, you know, the Chinese embassy bombing, that really sort of put a dent in. That puts a little bit of a dent in kind of in the very triumphalist version of the event. But in some ways, I mean, the question is, you know, whose opinion do we care? I think that thank you message, you know, on the wall in Kosovo, I mean, I think that, and the point that Eldin made about the fact that somebody cares. I mean, if the opinion that matters to us is the opinion of people who are potentially victims of ethnic cleansing, from their point of view, it appears that they were grateful and that they thought that it was, even with loss of lives to them as a result of the kind of the collateral damage, the idea that, I mean, this sort of notion that, you know, we're going to be killed anyway. At least this way we're not dying without a fight. At least this way somebody cares whether or not we die in large numbers.
Yeah, I think it is important to think about, of course, the suffering and the human rights angle in terms of action by the Americans and Europeans. I mean, even people who were wary of using military force, of course, you know, their hearts went out to people who were suffering tremendously. And another part of that learning that went on between the Bosnian War and the Kosovo War was that we took a very close look at what went wrong in Bosnia, but also at what happened, for example, in Rwanda The Rwandan genocide occurs in 3 months in early to mid 1994, right at the same time, right sort of, in the middle of the Bosnian War. And, both are horrific atrocities. In both cases, the UN made terrible mistakes in the way that it went about its peacekeeping work. And there was a tremendous amount of introspection then, from 1994, 1995 onward. And by the time 1999 rolled around, there had been a tremendous amount of discussion and thought about what we need to do when horrible things happen.
So we actually learned from the past. What a shocking idea that we might actually pay attention to the past. Now, earlier Eldin said that one of the things he would do with friends was collect shell casings. How much collateral damage are we talking about? I mean, we know that military today can be extremely effective, can strike very well, but it wasn't just NATO forces who were striking. There were obviously other forces bombing the heck out of things. What kind of do you remember seeing any collateral damage from NATO strikes at all, or?
Well, I don't. The parts that were hit by NATO, I've never lived close enough to where I could see that. But I mean, there was just in my hometown, and there's just plenty of houses that were completely blown up and things like that. And just one of the things I've noticed actually going back is as it was because I moved to the United States in '98, and a lot of that was 2 or 3 years after the war, and the damage was much greater than now that I've gone back twice since then. A lot of it was rebuilt, and you sort of see these scars are being patched up, and some house that was blown up, a new house might have been built on top of it or something like that. So you don't see as much of it, but certainly, I mean, the damage, it's still there. And for example, there's in Sarajevo a newspaper building that was bombed, and the intention is not to have it rebuilt as sort of this reminder. So in one of the main squares in Sarajevo, you have this huge, more or less office building that's as it was, when it was bombed in '92 or '3.
The one thing that I want to add is that part of the problem is the PR aspect of it. That Milosevic is a media savvy guy, and I think that part of what he tried to accomplish was, in a sense, to demonstrate, the brutality. Right? He's being accused of brutalities and atrocities. He's trying to demonstrate that NATO and the United States are just like him. And so, for example, there are a couple of things that happened, especially in the bombing of Kosovo. One is that he ordered the removal of evidence of the crimes committed by his regime. I mean, there was supposed to be kind of the cleansing of the cleansing of the traces of the cleansing, where mass graves were being dug up and bodies were being transported, so that in case, so that later on they could say, you said that you came here because all these people died. Look, where are they? There's nobody there. While at the same time, of course, playing up the deaths of Serbs as a result of the bombing, and certainly, again, having things like the Chinese, there were a couple of unfortunate mistakes that played up so well, kind of for media purposes, that raised questions in some people about the effectiveness of this kind of behavior. So I'm not sure I'm as positive as Jamie is about the valuable lessons learned, because I think that there I'd love to believe that, but I think that there's still a couple of question marks surrounding it.
I have to say I'm hardly positive about it. However, there was learning. So I don't think the world is anywhere near perfect yet, but there was learning between 1995 and 1999, and that paid off. Some people, I think this may take it a bit too far, but some people refer to Kosovo as the first war ever fought on behalf of human rights. Now, I think that's taking it a little too far, but I think there's a strong element of truth to it. There was also self-interest in NATO's actions against Serbia and the Kosovo War. But very clearly, this was, I think, an advance in the way that we handle these things. But of course, there are many, many problems, and we have a very long way to go to create a much better world than we have.
We do have a couple of other maps that will be coming up on the screen. One of them shows a series of locations where some sort of harassment or very aggressive attempts to cleanse. And as you can see, there's almost not a city on the map that doesn't have a red dot on it where there was some attempt to harass, cleanse, clean people out of Kosovo. And the next map actually shows the region and where people went. So the folks in Kosovo who did flee, they were heading to Macedonia and Albania and Montenegro. What was the global reaction to the folks who were moving out? In other words, were the people in Macedonia and Albania and Montenegro, were they welcoming people with open arms? Were they how were they received when they went there?
Nobody likes refugees.
Well, there are very fine ethnic balances in the region. So whenever a large influx of refugees of one ethnicity comes into your country, it really, especially because these countries are relatively small in population, it really upsets the ethnic balance and creates a tremendous amount of tension. And even, of course, if the refugees are generally fed and cared for by non-governmental organizations and UN agencies, etc., it also can be a real economic strain. So it certainly wasn't easy. And as Anne rightly notes, having refugees come into your country is never an easy thing to handle.
Right. And especially because the two countries are Macedonia and Albania, countries with their own not just ethnic problems but really severe economic problems. The poverty and the potential crime creates creates a lot of problems, but it also puts, for example, Albania in an interesting position if you're kicking out Albanians from Kosovo. Albania can potentially posture as the defender, the defender of all Albanians everywhere. Again, potentially straining relationships between Albania and Serbia and these neighboring countries. So in a sense, the refugees they're important that way, but also, the refugees can then be used, of course, and we've seen this in other parts of the world as well. Pictures of poor, suffering refugees are great, and in a sense, solving the refugee problem eliminates the possibility of using them for some purposes. So in a sense, you have people interested in perpetuating the misery of these groups of people for political ends. But of course, we're dealing with human beings who've just been kicked out of their homes, and I think Eldin's the stories that I'll mention are so important because that's that dimension of ethnic cleansing, right? Bomb the houses while people, ideally with people still in them, but even if they manage to get away, right, you still bomb their homes in the hopes that, your mom was determined to clean out the house, but the hope, of course, is that if there's no trace left of your home, that you won't want to come back, right? That's sort of the goal, and so the refugee problem is a very important aspect of this entire process.
And of course, whenever something like this happens, there is the challenge of trying to preserve the peace, however fragile that may be. And the last map we saw in that sequence up there actually showed Kosovo divided up into sections with countries given the challenge of policing those areas in many respects for preserving the peace.
Just one more thing. I think one of the sad things and kind of the self-perpetuating aspect of the process is that if the refugees don't have a natural place to go, for example, Bosnian Croats could go to Croatia. If people don't have a natural place to go, it underscores, in a way, the importance of having a nation state, right? This process sort of is the ethnic cleansing is an important and tragic aspect of nation building that we see in this region. But if you have groups of people that don't have a protector, if you don't have a protector country, then the international community has to be the one protecting you. The international community failed. Sometimes more spectacular, sometimes less spectacularly, but ultimately failed in protecting these people. And so in a sense, it promotes this need for, and this is why we must have a nation state of some sort somewhere, because without it, nobody is ever going to look out for us. And so that kind of fuels the process.
Well, one of the unique situations that we see here is that Slobodan Milosevic was actually tried for crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Tribunal, excuse me. Why don't we see that happening more often? Granted, Jamie did say this was sort of the first human rights war that was ever waged, but my goodness, there certainly have been other examples. Mm-hmm. What's the challenge here?
Well, there certainly have been, and this was a real step forward in international criminal law. The International Criminal Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia, which is this international court designed to try people for the most horrific crimes committed on the territory of former Yugoslavia between 1991 and 2001. This tribunal was the first war crimes tribunal since the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals that were held, of course, right after the end of World War II. So this was very significant. All of these terrible atrocities that occurred, of course, around the world, in the 50 years intervening. But finally, a court was established, and this was established in 1993. The trials are continuing today, and they're hoping to wrap up by 2011, but we're not sure that it won't go beyond that. But it's very significant. The first sentences were handed down in the early to mid-90s. So far, 63 people have been sentenced out of a total of 161. And keep in mind that these are the top-level people, so that's why the numbers are relatively small. But 63 people so far have been convicted, and among these have been some convictions for genocide. And earlier on I mentioned that there's this debate about whether the crimes rise to the level of genocide. I think that these convictions make a clear case that genocide also was going on in the territory of former Yugoslavia. In fact, when Slobodan Milosevic was brought up on trial, genocide was one of the charges brought against him for his actions with regard to Bosnia.
Obviously, one of the differences here in terms of Nuremberg and Tokyo and Milosevic trial is that we have mass communication now. We're able to see these things a lot more immediately than ever before, and I think that's probably changed a little bit the way people perceive these sorts of events. Eldin, you still read papers from Bosnia, and you still stay up to date on what's happening there. How did the trials play in the media there?
Well, I think there's been a general criticism of the process being too slow or ineffective, and I think this has lessened a bit after Karadzic was arrested. But the main criticism was that the most responsible people were not in custody, so they weren't even on trial as of yet. And the people that were on trial were sort of the mid tier to higher tier. The very top people were somehow managed to escape prosecution. There was a criticism of both the domestic governments and also the West for not doing more to make sure that so that these people were arrested. Because there's also criticism that, for example, sometimes that the desire for justice is almost given up for pragmatic purposes. So that we could move on and cut deals for other things or whatever, and that the West sometimes is reluctant to push these countries to really make the right compromises, because they may need their cooperation on other things. I think a story I would like to bring up is that a man by the name of Sefer Halilovic, who was probably the highest level Muslim that was brought up at The Hague, and he was acquitted. I'm not familiar with the details of the case and all of that, but it created this whole media storm where, especially the Serbs felt that The Hague was disproportionately affecting them. That most of the people that were indicted were Serbs, and that their main criticism is that yes, we did abuses, but they feel that in the West that they're being disproportionately blamed. So when when Sefer Halilovic was acquitted, this created this whole media storm about are the Serbs being unjustly targeted or not, and I don't want to really go into deep into it, but in general there's just been a criticism of various aspects of the process at various stages.
I just wanted to say that this issue of blame, and this came up earlier. I mean, we have to say that there were atrocities committed on all sides, but basically there's more or less a consensus that 90% of it can be attributed to actions committed by the Serb military and paramilitary units. So I think that's an important thing to mention, that while they feel victimized and targeted, sort of the mass graves kind of have produced the evidence to produce the kinds of arrests and indictments.
Mm-hmm. Well, there certainly are a lot of criticisms of the tribunal, and a lot of them are valid. Especially the slowness of these trials is infuriating to those of us who would, of course, love to see some justice happen to horrible people. At the same time, there was, of course, a reason for it to be that slow, and the reason is that the court was just being very careful, painstakingly careful, to make sure that all due process was provided to people on trial, because all these cases are setting precedents for the future. And if in the future we want to be able to prosecute people for horrific crimes against other human beings, we need to sort of set a record for how this can be done very responsibly. And the ICTY, this tribunal, began early in the 90s. Soon after, began a tribunal about Rwanda, known as the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And these two courts, on Yugoslavia and Rwanda, set many precedents in the prosecution of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And in fact, their relative success, and this is taking into account, the many frustrations we have with them, the relative success of these tribunals led, of course, to the creation of the world's first permanent international criminal court, known as the International Criminal Court. And I just need to say that that court is empowered to try people only for 3 crimes: crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes. So this isn't a court that's going to come after you for breaking into your neighbor's house and violate the sovereignty of the United States in order to do so. You have to commit the most egregious crimes imaginable to even be eligible for perhaps one day coming before this court.
And I think part of the frustration that some people feel with the slowness of the, although I completely agree with Jamie about the need to be absolutely perfect in order to make sure that this can't later be, be criticized and not be able to use it as a precedent. Part of the frustration is, the long gap between, obviously horrific things happened between 1946 and 1993 when the court was created. But part of the problem is the Cold War. In the atmosphere of the Cold War, the idea that the world could come together and agree on what is a crime against humanity and what isn't was really not realistic. And so there is this sense of optimism that with the end of the Cold War, perhaps this is a chance to address some of these grievances. And so the slowness of the process, and it's so frustrating, precisely because even though the Cold War was over, there were still so many differences and disagreements. Russia feeling, kind of the loyalty with Serbia and being potentially kind of a thorn in the proceedings, but not just Russia. France was very reluctant to allow the proceedings to go on. The UN didn't want to, didn't want to support the court financially initially. All of these different things. It's very frustrating to think that, okay, with the end of the Cold War, everything is supposed to be okay, and yet it does not appear to be the case.
So should we expect trials to happen faster now? Should we expect a little speedier trial?
Well, I don't know about the speedier trial. We, Jamie and I kind of have a unique perspective because we were very fortunate in December of 2008 to actually go to The Hague for a conference dealing with the Genocide Convention, thanks to the support from the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences and the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. And we got to go actually and sit in on the proceedings of the international, the tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And Jamie had a longer experience there. Maybe he can talk more about the longer experience, but I only had one day. And I think what I found about it was not just the slowness, but sort of the unsatisfactory nature of it, sort of the atrocities committed, and then watching these administrative proceedings. And the day we were there was wrangling about, it's not even hard to even remember what the wrangling was about, but it just seemed so, it's such unbelievable minutia. And I think one of the things that it points to is that while it needs to happen and it's an important precedent-setting thing, ultimately I can't imagine how it could possibly be satisfying to the people whose family members were destroyed in the process. And so that perhaps, hopefully, one of the things that the court creates is not just the ability to prosecute future atrocities, but the determination to avoid allowing future atrocities to happen. Because certainly prosecuting afterwards is better than not prosecuting afterwards. But how much better would it be not to have to prosecute, not to prosecute anybody, because you can't undo. You can't return those lives lost and the destruction that took place.
And that is, of course, the hope that that the Permanent International Criminal Court will eventually provide a deterrent to people who otherwise would want to commit these atrocities. And we already see some examples of some pretty appalling people around the world changing their behavior, at least slightly, in response to, possibly being brought to The Hague and put on trial at this new international court. We see the president of Sudan changing his behavior somewhat after being indicted. Some others as well in Uganda and elsewhere.
Eldin, you said you've been back to the region. You said that a few times. I'm assuming you've been back a few times as well. What's the region like today?
I've been twice in 2003 and 2007. I think I've also been to Croatia, and I've been to my hometown in Bosnia. I've been to Croatia, so I've traveled a bit, and I think that there's a tremendous variety. So, for example, in Croatia, there's a sense that that it's the country that's next closest to meeting the conditions to enter the European Union. Its economy is a bit better, and people there generally view the war as the cost that had to be paid in order to gain independence and to rejoin Europe and that forth. But in Bosnia, things are always more complicated because of the underlying issues, and I don't know. I think I just focus on one of the problems. I think is that Bosnia was and the region in general has all the problems of the rest of the other post-communist countries. So corruption, organized crime, drugs, all of that. But on top of that, you had the war. So these economies weren't exactly rich under communism, and now they've become even poorer because of the war. And now with the emergence of the market economy, there's all kinds of issues with corruption. War profiteers who made their money during the war have now become the elite that run the country, and so there's all these other issues. I guess I can only speak about my hometown in particular because I know it better than the rest of the country, but the economy there is particularly bad, and oftentimes people just rely on remittances sent from Bosnians living abroad, or they find employment in countries like Slovenia and Croatia, sometimes legally, sometimes not. But the problems with the current financial crisis, a lot of those people who found these jobs in Slovenia and Croatia are coming back to Bosnia where they can't find other jobs. So there's this, just basic problems. You can disregard the war, but there's just basic economic problems and things like that. But the one variable that's always present is that nationalism sort of pervades daily life. I just don't see national reconciliation taking part, and I guess you'd sort of expect that newer generations would sort of embrace it a bit more. But there's problems. I guess I'll just bring up this problem that happens in the Federation where Muslims and Croats live, which is within Bosnia is now split in two basic parts, and here they have the phenomenon of what they call two schools under one roof, which is basically ethnic segregation, where technically it's unconstitutional, but it continues, and basically the teachers oppose it because then if you consolidate two classrooms, the teacher would be out of a job. So the teachers are for it and the parents are for it, and you have a classroom of 12 students and a classroom of 7 students of each ethnic group having its own, instead of one classroom where you could have a single room. I guess I just maybe bring up some of these other stories. Bosnia hasn't had a census since the war. And again, there's a basic need for a government to do a census for public policy purposes, but nationalism sort of prevents this because mostly the Muslims just feel that if you conducted a census now, it would reflect the consequences of ethnic cleansing, and that that's why the census has been delayed for this long. The Bosnia doesn't have a national anthem with lyrics. I actually got one 2 weeks ago, but there's also this argument about if we create a national anthem with lyrics, what the lyrics are going to be, who they're going to favor one side over the other. Now finally they did produce a national anthem with that just talks generically about rivers and mountains and things like that, and it's like the only compromise that could be made. But I don't know, just the one thing I noticed is that people try to continue their daily lives, and in many ways you just have to move on, but even normal day-to-day activities are sort of permeated by these issues that just won't go away.
Yeah.
Oh, well, and this is, I think that this is a really depressing aspect of the ethnic cleansing, the extent, the depth of the impact and the permanence of the results, that you have this vibrant without romanticizing the happy paradise under Tito or under communism, but you do have a vibrant, diverse community where people live side by side, and yes, they may not get along from time to time, but ultimately they live side by side. And then as a result of the ethnic cleansing, you don't have that anymore. That diversity, that rich culture and life, that has been lost, and it appears, all signs suggest that that's permanent. That is not. That there's really no going. That there's no going back to that kind of a world, in part because, of course, the conflict pitted, members of the community against each other. You have people living side by side, and then during the ethnic cleansing, they were the ones carrying out the atrocities. It's hard to, you can't blame people for not wanting to live next door to the guy who raped your mom in front of you. That it makes really perfect sense, but it really is tragic, the extent to which it's not clear what the future holds for the region.
So what is the long-term prognosis here?
Well, I can't say that. I suppose I should
preface this by saying we political scientists are good at explaining, but not very good at predicting.
We never like.
I thought that's what political scientists did.
No, we explain. We don't predict.
Explain. Political scientists
We'll have to
predict.
talk about this later. I don't think there are many people who predict a really rosy outcome for Bosnia for the reasons that Anne and Eldin have already said. These, as I and Anne said earlier, these were wars of ethnic cleansing where the point was to drive people off the land, and so people will have memories of this. They will, children will grow up hearing their parents and grandparents saying, look, our house isn't really here. Our house really is 200 miles away, but we just can't live there right now. And so people, the danger is that people, that future generations and present generations become socialized into thinking that at one point this injustice needs to be rectified. And, the war was ended through essentially a partition of Bosnia. As Eldin said, the country was, and the country was divided into two parts, but that merely ratified the ethnic cleansing that had taken place, artificially in many ways, putting people into areas where they hadn't lived before. So it's going to be very hard to achieve national reconciliation.
And I mean, they will probably, what it requires is, of course, responsible politicians, you know, better public policy, better educational system. But if you continue having these, you know, the separate schools, no census, not and all of these different things. I mean, this is not kind of a good starting point. And nationalism. I mean, nationalism continues to be used as an effective mobilizing strategy. The third aspect of it is the international community. The question is if the revisionists, you know, because there is a danger of revisionism, right? I mean, there's a danger of people who grow up under these conditions who would like to, you know, get their land back, get their houses back, or simply just enact revenge against people who did horrible things to their ancestors. And the question is, if something happens again, what will be the international community's response? Will they pay attention? Will they try to catch it in its early stages, or will there be reluctance to get involved yet again with those people, you know, over there, given so many different problems that we have? And I have, you know, Samantha Power's book here, and she was here, and she was here last year, and this is something that this is the point that she made in her lecture that I found so poignant, is that precisely because the intervention, especially in Kosovo, was a humanitarian one, right? That makes it very important, but at the same time, right now, the American standing in the world is somewhat problematic, marred by our recent policies, which makes our ability to get involved effectively in humanitarian conflicts that much more problematic. So it's not clear if something does go terribly wrong, just in Europe itself, because we know that things are going terribly wrong in other parts of the world. But if it does go wrong in Europe again, in this region, the question is, will we still have the international standing to be able to get effectively involved?
Well, Eldin, we're actually going to give you the final word. What's the prognosis?
Well, I guess, I mean, in many ways it can be mixed. One thing that is worth bringing up is the demographics. The population demographics of Bosnia are, you know, sort of not exactly ideal for an economy, because a lot of the most productive people that you'd expect to run society, you know, many have moved abroad or have died, and, you know, you have this huge imbalance where you have a lot of elderly people and, you know, relatively few, you know, able-bodied individuals. I don't know. I mean, I'm still hopeful, because I think although these problems with nationalism remain, and I mean, I could, you know, tell other stories about how it, you know, affects things, but I think, you know, the general appetite for another conflict or something like that amongst the, you know, average people is very low. So I think to actually mobilize these tensions into another war, you know, obviously there's a certain danger to it, but I don't think it's likely. And I mean, generally, I guess the plan or the hope is that you know, if at some point these countries can join, you know, if Bosnia and Croatia and so forth, if they could join the European Union, then hopefully some of the benefits of the European Union in terms of political stability has brought to other European countries, that hopefully it would work the same magic here. And I guess, you know, only time will tell. But
well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I especially want to thank our panelists here, Ann Livschiz from the Department of History, Jamie Toole from the Department of Political Science, Eldin Hasic, who is a student here at IPFW. I also want to thank CATV for recording this, as they have for a number of others. This was one in a series of programs devoted to the end of the Cold War. We hope that you enjoyed it, and we hope that you'll be watching when we have our next one. Thank you.